And notwithstanding its success in promoting public health, California has historically been a relative latecomer to adopting and increasing tobacco taxes. That history begins in the depths of the Civil War, when the federal government imposed its first tax on cigarettes in 1864. This was long before anyone recognized the risks of tobacco consumption, so the decision was driven less by concerns over public health than it was by concerns over public finance. Burdened with the enormous cost of funding the Union's war efforts, the federal government initiated an unprecedented expansion in the types of taxes imposed on civilians, including, among other things, cigarettes. Most of these Civil War-era taxes were repealed after the conflict ended, but the cigarette tax stayed in place, and it would remain the only major tobacco tax in the U.S. for the next 50 years. That changed in 1921 when Iowa instituted its own tax on cigarettes and sparked what would become a national trend. Soon after Iowa's decision, South Carolina, South Dakota, Utah, and Tennessee all jumped on the tobacco tax bandwagon. And over the next 3 decades, they were followed by a cascade of 40 more states and the District of Columbia. This policy shift was so widespread and so definitive that by the end of the 1950s, California was one of only 5 states that had yet to impose a tax on cigarettes, along with Virginia, Colorado, Oregon, and North Carolina. California finally took the plunge in 1959, and within the next decade, every state in the country had its own tobacco tax on the books. California's tax on cigarettes began at a modest 3 cents per pack, which by 1967 had grown to a comparatively hefty 10 cents per pack. Shortly thereafter, tax collectors began to observe a troubling trend in California's tobacco sales. People were still buying cigarettes, but were somehow obtaining them without paying the tax. What lawmakers failed to anticipate was that in raising the tax so suddenly and so substantially, California had unwittingly thrust itself into the middle of a black market. Californians who felt overburdened by the increase quickly became privy to the knowledge that the tax did not apply on either military bases or Indian reservations, both of which were abundant in California. As a result, anyone who had access to these areas or knew someone who did could purchase their cigarettes tax-free. While this experience didn't dissuade lawmakers enough to lower the tax, it made them intensely apprehensive about raising it further, so much so that California's 10-cent tax on cigarettes would stay in place for the next 2 decades, and it would require direct intervention by the people for that rate to increase.